Welcome to Urban Plot Armor. We are back with part 2 of our High Elves Non-Legendary Lord Guides. In part 1 we went through the overview of the 3 lords and their skill tree priorities. In this episode we will focus on the number 3 ranked Legendary Lord choice. Disclaimer, this is based on campaign play, and while I've researched popular opinions and tried them myself, all guidance here is based on what I've found to be effective through multiple playthroughs on Legendary difficulty without mods. I'm always open to improving and presenting the best information possible, so if you have a correction or something to add, please I invite you to share in the comments below. And with that done, let's get started. Now, when ranking the non-legendary lords, we're going to have to consider a few criteria. So first of all, I value quite high a character that scales well from the early to the late game. For example, a buff that only improves archers, maybe not so useful in the late game, but some of the same traits will boost archers in the early game as well as Sisters of Avalorn in the late game, and that is awesome. So also the overall strength of the character also depends on the utility in campaign. Are they easy to recruit in the first place? Are the units they buff easy to recruit in the first place? And are the units they buff actually good and reliable to make a large part of your fighting forces? Coming in at number 3. 3 out of 3, so unfortunately last place, but it is the High Elf Prince. Now, the High Elf Prince has some strength, so the moment you get him at level 1 at the start of the game, he's actually quite good outside the box because he carries a shield, he's good at melee, and he's great at holding the line, which is super important in the early game to let your archers, which are your best unit, do their work. He's very reliable, survivable, but the worst thing about him is that he really does need a good trait in order to get any value out of him in the long term. He gets outshined in his traits by the princess to some extent, but a good prince trait is better than a bad princess trait, so it's just to be mindful. So when in the early game, this guy's a great guy to pick up, but the problem is that you just have to make sure you check the princesses first for their trait before you hire a prince, and then check that he's got a better trait or not. The biggest challenge that princes face when compared to archmages and princesses is when they receive their dragon mounts. All lords get dramatically stronger when they get mounted on their dragon, but they want to be flying around, breathing fire, maybe landing a cycle charge, but then back in the air again, breathing fire. Casters and ranged units get much more opportunity when doing this on a dragon. On the flying mount, they have far more opportunity to do damage with their ranged weapon or spells. The prince does not get this, and he again is stuck cycle charging in and out, which is still something available to princesses and archmages. Another thing that both the prince and the princess do share is that they both really struggle to compete late game with the archmage. So spoiler alert, I'm sorry, but what's more important is we can still look at some builds and some ways that we can run our princes that are still viable in the mid to late game. Which lord is better is very, very much dependent on the traits that they are given when you hire them. All lord skills are either free, meaning they have a negative trait, have 15, which is a good trait, or a cost of 60 influence, which gives them a great trait. All of these build suggestions are going to be based on the 60 influence traits, because there's generally an equivalent that's around 15. So if you don't have enough influence for a 60 influence trait, you can always try to cheap out the 15, depending on your situation. So when you go to hire a lord, you should always look at the traits that are available before making that decision. A princess with a bad trait is definitely not better than a prince with a great trait. Now, I want to just make very clear that there's probably only one of these I would actually still use, but there's still a couple which can still be used, especially in the early stages. Now, there's only 2 others that I'm adding in as honorable mentions just to start off with, because they're not competitive ways of playing, but the prince does it better than anyone else, so it deserves an honourable mention. The first of these is the champion build. Now, the champion build basically is a prince who flies in on a dragon, beats the crap out of someone, holds the line against a monster, basically tries to just delay things and maybe be a bit of a try-hard Emmerich beatstick, and while they're doing that, the rest of the army can do the work, and he'll basically deal with other lords, so the rest of the army doesn't have to do it. So, not so good anymore, but actually it was never really good. Let's be honest, melee is not that strong in this game, but if you did want to do it, the way you make this character is you go down the lightning strike path, do melee defense and melee attack as far as they'll go, boost your armor, boost your damage with weapon strength, and then definitely go for a star dragon. If for some reason you must go on a horse, this is probably the way I would build a cavalry-based lord. However, horses have the massive catch in campaign of being pretty damn useless in sieges. In my opinion, keeping them on foot to avoid anti-large damage and be a line holder, or being an aerial unit to be able to fly over walls, is far more useful. The weaknesses are, of course, that you can't cast spells, and boy does the Incendiary Mage do it better than he does. No more on this, let's go to the next honourable mention. Next on the list of honourable mentions is the Legionary build. This allows a Lord, if you really want to run one on foot, to be passable maybe at best. Again, this is not recommended when you have the Dragon mounts available, but if you did really want to do it the hard way and stay on foot, this is the way to do it. The buff that you want to give them is the Vigorous trait. This gives a 15% ward save against everything, as well as perfect vigor, meaning they can sit and grind in the front line while the archers pop in and do the rest of the work. Now moving on to the more realistic and practical builds. We have the Elite Infantry General build. Again, not recommended. Melee is not great in Total War Warhammer 2. I would definitely never go down this route, especially if you're playing on Legendary difficulty, but again, if you really must use Swordmasters of Hoth, Phoenix Guard, and you just want to have an elite group of crack core infantry for High Elves, this is the way to do it. This is by far the most effective way to get it to work. So the trait you use is Resistant. Resistant gives plus 15% magic resistance, plus 10% missile resistance, and plus 5 melee defense to the entire army. So that is awesome. Those line holding spearmen will hold longer. The Swordmasters of Hoth can actually hang a little bit longer. So when you're building this build, you need to make sure, of course, always go Lightning Strike, it's compulsory, but then instead of Quartermaster, I'd probably put my points in Elven Healing. Because you're running infantry, you will take more losses, so therefore getting them back up with probably a Noble in there as well, and maybe a Handmaiden to get that replenishment up, that's probably the way I would run it. Auto-Resolve hates infantry, so you're going to have to fight a lot of battles. Just another reason not to run this build, but again, the Prince does it better than anyone else, and it's worth mentioning that. The strength is that it makes elite infantry maybe viable, but the weakness is that you still can't cast spells, and melee is melee, and this is Total Warhammer 2. The Dragon Rouser build. Dragons, particularly Star Dragons, are the best monster that is available to the High Elves. Now, Dragon Will, this trait, will allow you to recruit them one turn quicker, as well as for 20% less upkeep upkeep every single turn. Now, that will combine with Quartermaster to a total of negative 35% upkeep. So the way you build this character is you want to go Lightning Strike to Quartermaster, and then put it into Feared and Renowned to get that last bit of additional upkeep reduction. Up next, and this is my favourite, it's not the most glamorous or sexy one, but it is pretty good overall, because it is one that is actually useful from the early game all the way until the late game, and that is the Governor build. Now, the trait you'll use in this is Efficient. Efficient means it gives you a bonus to Illyrian Reavers and Cavalry, whatever, but more importantly, minus 25% upkeep to Archers, Spearmen, great in the early game, as well as Silverin Guard, Lothan Sea Guard, and Sisters of Avalon. All three of those can be used to the mid to the late game to great effect. So this is already starting to speak my language. I do like cost reduction. Now, this might be the only time, instead of where you would take the +3 to Public Order in your skill tree when you're building towards Lightning Strike. The reason being is this guy can have a use. Once you conquer with your main army, you'll need another army to often sit there and babysit the province to stop it from rebelling or deal with rebellions, or even still deal with invasions from other factions. So you stick this guy in with a full stack of Sisters or anything like that, all that good stuff, Sisters, Silverin Guard, and this guy will make sure nothing gets through there, and more importantly, even just by sitting there, he's helping get that Public Order back under control, which will improve the tax, will improve the growth rate, and you'll be able to move on and expand much quicker. So he still is useful in the late game, unlike most of the other Prince builds. So that is why this gets my #1 slot in terms of Prince builds. To clarify as well, Princesses do get a trait that allows them to reduce upkeep, but it's Ardent and it reduces Archer upkeep by 30%. This doesn't translate into the late game like it does for Princes, which are able to lower the upkeep for Archers, as well as the late game units like Sisters of Avalon, which are very expensive. By now I'm sure you're noticing the trend that Princes provide great buffs, but the units that they buff are just not that viable on the higher levels of difficulty. Now, just to quickly run through the skill tree for some general guidance for the Prince, as you know, always starting off at Route Marcher, 3 points in Wary, and then you can choose which one you would like out of these three. doesn't really matter. Of course, Draftmaster and then Lightning Strike. Now, depending on which build you want or where you want to focus, and which difficulty you're on will depend what you do next. You can either, as previously stated, put 3 points into Bowmaster to improve your archers, or you can go ahead and make your guy more tanky. On high difficulties, reducing upkeep or healing can be very desirable. And as you know, I'm a fan of Renown and Beard for some extra campaign movement and even cheaper armies. Always 3 points into Bowmaster, whether you do it before or after putting some points into Swordmaster, and the high priority here is melee defense. Melee defense is always king. After melee defense, melee attack is your next priority. If you want to continue along this tree, which I do recommend, 2 more points in melee defense, and then of course armor. The trade here is Deadly Onslaught. It can be quite nice and a good way to put some damage on if your guy is damage dealer, so we're going to select that. I also tend to put 2 points into Woundmaker to get 20% additional damage. The mount, as you know, always go for the Star Dragon. You want missile resistance and speed of Syrian to be more survivable. Magic resistance can't hurt either. Of course, once you're level 20, Immortality, and then you can choose to take whichever of the dedications will pertain best to your army. Great early game choice, which is when you would probably recruit this guy, is Dedication of Isha. That 5% upkeep will definitely help, as well as casualty replenishment on high difficulties. Leftover points can be spent either proceeding down the red tree or putting them into Elven Healing. Either are good options. You usually can't go too wrong with putting at least 1 point into Favourable Winds, because this will boost your archers at high level. And that's the end of our guide on the High Elf Princes. Next episode we will have the number 2 ranked High Elf Non-Legendary Lord. My name's been Ryder, and this has been Elven Plot Armor. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more content like this, might I suggest that you subscribe, and if it's been entertaining, please feel free to give it a like. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.